30 years I spent saving lives on the operating table. 30 years and not one complaint. Then one morning, the hospital board called me in and told me someone had accused me of forging patient records, falsifying the very charts I had signed my name to. I sat there certain it was a mistake, some clerical error we would laugh about later. And then I saw my wife's face across the room. She was not shocked. She was not angry on my behalf. She already knew. That was the moment the ground opened beneath 30 years of my life. I just did not know yet how far down it went. There are mornings a man remembers for the rest of his life, and he almost never knows it while they're happening. That Thursday felt like any other. I drank my coffee at the counter the way I had for 26 years, poured a second cup out of habit, and let it go cold beside the sink. Outside, the maples along the drive were turning the color of rust. I had 2 surgeries scheduled and a waiting room full of people who still called me by my first name. I was a lucky man. I believed that, standing there in my own kitchen. I want you to understand that I believed it, because in a few hours I would not believe anything at all. My name is Elliot Hastings. For 30 years, I was a cardiothoracic surgeon at Ashcombe Regional here in Nashville, Tennessee. 30 years with my hands inside people's chests, holding the one muscle that keeps a life running. In 30 years, I never lost a patient I could have saved, and I never once had a complaint filed against me. I tell you this not out of pride. I tell you so you understand what it meant when a nurse walked into my office that morning, set a folder on my desk, and could not look me in the eye. Her name was Colleen. She had worked the surgical floor for 11 years, and she was the kind of woman who spoke her mind about everything from the cafeteria coffee to the parking situation. But that morning she just said, "The board wants to see you." This morning. They said now. Then she left before I could ask her a single question. I opened the folder. It was thin. A single sheet of hospital letterhead and 3 words near the top that I read 4 times before they made any sense. Falsification of records. Below it, 3 patient case numbers I did not recognize. I remember laughing, actually. A short, confused laugh, the kind you make when someone tells you a joke you don't understand yet. Somebody had made a mistake. That was the only explanation. In a hospital that size, charts got crossed, names got typed wrong, files got attached to the wrong account. I had spent 3 decades trusting that the truth of a thing eventually rose to the surface on its own. I picked up the folder, straightened my tie, and walked to the elevator, like a man on his way to clear up a clerical error. The boardroom was on the 4th floor, a long table under fluorescent light, a wall of windows looking out over the parking structure. There were 7 people waiting for me. I knew all of them. The chief of medicine, 2 administrators, hospital counsel, a woman from compliance whose name I could never remember. And at the far end, standing near the windows with a paper cup of water in her hand, was my wife. Vivian was the head nurse of the surgical department. It was not strange for her to be in that building, on that floor, even in that room. We had built our whole life inside these walls. We met here 28 years ago when I was a resident, and she was the sharpest scrub nurse anyone had seen in a decade. We raised our daughter to walk these same halls, so no, it was not strange to see her there. What was strange was her face. I had spent 26 years of marriage learning that face. I knew it when she was tired, when she was angry, when she was pretending to be fine at her mother's funeral. I knew the small tightening around her eyes when she was about to defend me because she had done it 100 times at dinner parties and hospital galas. Whenever someone said something careless about a surgeon's ego, I walked into that room expecting to find that face. The one that would catch my eye across the table and say without a word, "This is absurd, and we will fix it together." That was not the face she was wearing. She would not look at me. Her eyes moved to the window, to the cup in her hand, to the chief of medicine, to the floor. Everywhere except the one place they had gone naturally for 26 years. And there was something worse than the not looking. There was no shock in her. Everyone else in that room wore the careful, uncomfortable expression of people about to deliver bad news to a colleague. Vivian wore nothing, a stillness, a patience, the look of a person waiting for a thing she already knew was coming. "Elliot, please sit down," the chief said. I sat. They began to talk, and I heard perhaps half of it. 3 patients over the past 14 months. Post-operative complications. Charts that had been altered after the fact. Entries changed, timestamps adjusted. My electronic signature attached to notes I was being told contained falsified information. A formal complaint had been submitted. An internal review was now mandatory. Effective immediately, I was to be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. My surgical privileges were suspended. I kept waiting for someone to say the sentence that would end all of this. I kept waiting for Vivian to set down her paper cup and say, "There has been a terrible mistake. This man has never falsified anything in his life. I have watched him work for 26 years. The sentence never came. She stood by the window, and she said nothing at all, and her silence was so loud I could barely hear the chief of medicine explaining how to surrender my badge. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" Hospital counsel asked me. I looked at the 3 case numbers on the sheet in front of me. I looked at the faces around the table, people I had trained beside, operated beside, buried colleagues beside. And then I looked at my wife and I asked her a question. Not the board, her. "Vivian," I said, "you know I would never do this. Tell them." The room went quiet. Every head turned toward her. And for one long moment, my wife of 26 years looked at me finally directly, and I saw something in her eyes I had never seen aimed at me in all our years together. It was not love. It was not even anger. It was the flat, measuring calm of a stranger deciding how much to say. "I think," she said slowly, "that Elliot has been under a great deal of stress." That was all. That was her answer. Not a defense. Not a denial. A quiet little knife slipped between my ribs so gently that for a second I did not even feel it go in. Under a great deal of stress. The phrase you use about a man you are preparing everyone to stop believing. I don't remember standing. I remember being in the hallway, my badge no longer clipped to my coat, the folder still in my hand. I remember the fluorescent lights and the smell of the place I had given my life to. And I remember the single thought turning over and over in my mind, cold and clear and impossible to stop. She wasn't surprised. In that entire room on the worst morning of my life, my wife was the only person who was not surprised, which meant she had known this was coming, which meant she had known for a long time. I had walked into that building believing I was a man with a clerical error to fix. I walked out of it beginning to understand that I was a man who did not know his own wife at all, and the ground that had held me for 30 years was already quietly beginning to open. To understand how a man ends up standing in a hallway stripped of the only work he has ever loved, you have to go back further than that Thursday morning. You have to understand what I had and how little I ever thought to protect it. Because I was not a foolish man. I read contracts before I signed them. I checked my patient's charts twice. But it never once occurred to me that the person I needed to watch was the woman sleeping beside me. Vivian and I met in the autumn of 1996. I was a second-year resident running on 3 hours of sleep, and she was the scrub nurse who caught my mistake before I made it quietly, without embarrassing me in front of the attending. That was the thing about her. She saw everything. In an operating room, that is the highest praise you can give a person. She saw everything and she missed nothing. And for 26 years, I loved her for exactly the quality that would one day be used to destroy me. We married 2 years later in a small church in East Nashville. We could not afford a honeymoon, so we spent our first married weekend painting the walls of a rented duplex. And I remember thinking that I would never in my life be happier than I was that Sunday. Both of us covered in pale yellow paint, laughing about nothing. Our daughter Emily was born 4 years after that. Vivian went back to work when Emily started school, and she rose fast the way people who see everything tend to. By the time she was 40, she was head nurse of the entire surgical department. We were by every visible measure a success. The respected surgeon and his sharp, capable wife. People used us as an example. I overheard a younger couple at a hospital dinner once, the wife nodding toward us and saying, "That's what I want us to be someday." I carried that sentence around like a warm coin in my pocket for weeks. I tell you all of this so that you understand. I was not blind by accident. I was blind on purpose, the way happy people are. When you have built something good, you stop inspecting the foundation. You assume it will hold because it has always held. And Vivian gave me no reason to look closer. She was, if anything, more attentive in those last few years, not less. She organized my schedule. She reminded me of birthdays. She handled the parts of our life I found tedious, and I was grateful. And I never asked why a woman with her own demanding career would want to take on more. The first change, the one I can see clearly only now, came about 18 months before that Thursday. It was small, it was administrative, it was the kind of thing that does not feel like the beginning of anything. Our department had switched to a new electronic record system the year before, and the transition had been a disaster. Charts vanished, timestamps came back wrong. The younger doctors adapted quickly, but the rest of us struggled, and the hospital was hemorrhaging money on compliance errors. At a staff meeting one afternoon, the administration announced they were assigning a senior nurse to oversee documentation integrity for the surgical department. Someone experienced, someone trusted, someone who understood both the clinical side and the paperwork. Someone who would have full access to every chart, every entry, every signature in the department. They gave the position to Vivian. I remember being pleased. I remember thinking it was a smart choice, that if anyone could bring order to that mess, it was my wife. I remember her coming home that evening, a little flushed, a little excited, and I opened a bottle of wine we had been saving and we toasted to it. To Vivian, keeper of the records. She laughed when I said it. I did not understand then what I had just toasted, because what that position gave her was not just responsibility. It was the ability to enter any patient's chart in our department and change it, to adjust a timestamp, to alter a note, to attach a signature, and to do all of it inside a system that on paper only recorded that a change had been made by an authorized user with clearance. She had the keys to every door, and she had my complete, unquestioning trust that she would never open the wrong one. For the first several months, nothing seemed different. She talked about her new duties at dinner, complained about the backlog, showed me spreadsheets I pretended to understand. If anything, it made us closer. We had more to talk about. I felt foolishly that we were more of a team than ever. Then slowly, she stopped talking about the work. When I asked how the documentation project was going, she would say fine or busy and change the subject. I assumed it was tedium. Nobody wants to bring home 8 hours of spreadsheets and then discuss them over pasta. So I let it go. I always let things go. That was my great talent and my great flaw, the thing my own father had drilled into me without ever meaning to. Keep your head down, do good work, and the truth will take care of itself. There was one evening, maybe a year before the board meeting, that I have thought about 1,000 times since. I came downstairs late for a glass of water and found Vivian at the kitchen table laptop open, the blue light on her face. It was well past midnight. She was not typing. She was just staring at the screen, one hand pressed flat against her mouth, the way a person sits when they are deciding to do something they cannot undo. I stood on the bottom step for a moment, watching her, and I felt a small, strange chill I could not name, the kind you feel walking into a room where an argument has just ended. Then she heard me, and she closed the laptop with a speed that at the time meant nothing to me at all. "Couldn't sleep," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. "Just catching up on charts." She smiled at me. It was a good smile. I have since learned that the best liars are not the ones who look away. They are the ones who look right at you. I kissed the top of her head and told her not to stay up too late and went back to bed. I did not ask which charts. I did not ask why catching up on documentation required the lights off and the door to the study closed. I was a man who trusted his wife. It was, I believed, one of the better things about me. I know now that somewhere in those quiet months, while I slept soundly one floor above her, my wife was already at work. Not on the records. On me. The first patient chart she altered belonged to a man named Harold Pruitt. I did not know his name that Thursday in the boardroom. I would come to know it very well, because Harold Pruitt was the first stone laid in a wall built to bury me. And the strange, terrible truth was that on the day his chart was changed, I had been standing not 20 feet away, scrubbing in for another surgery, humming to myself a happy man, with no idea that the ground beneath his life had already begun to give way. Harold Pruitt was 71 years old, a retired postal carrier from Murfreesboro with a bad valve and a good sense of humor. I replaced that valve on a cold morning in the spring, a clean operation textbook, from first cut to last suture. He did well. He walked out of my hospital 9 days later on his own 2 feet, and he sent me a card that Christmas with a photograph of himself holding a fish. I remember all of this because I remember my patients. What I did not remember, what I could not have remembered, was signing a note in his chart 4 days after his discharge, describing a medication error that never happened. I learned about that note the afternoon of the board meeting, sitting at my own kitchen table with the folder open in front of me, and a cup of coffee I could not bring myself to drink. Once the shock had dulled enough for me to think I did the only thing I knew how to do. I went looking for the truth in the records the way I had gone looking for it my whole life. I still had remote access to the archived system that evening. They had suspended my privileges, but the technology takes a few days to catch up with the paperwork, and so for one night, I could still see the charts. I pulled up all 3 case numbers from the complaint. Harold Pruitt, a woman named Denise Alvarado, a man named Walter Boyd. 3 patients I had treated over the past 14 months. 3 good outcomes as I remembered them, and 3 charts that now told a different story. The alterations were subtle. That was the terrible craftsmanship of it. Nobody had invented a dead patient or a botched surgery. Instead, small notes had been added days after the fact. A delayed response to a complication. A medication administered at the wrong dose. A follow-up order that was never entered. Each one on its own the kind of small human error that happens in every hospital. But together 3 of them across 14 months, all bearing my signature. They painted the portrait of a surgeon growing careless. A man slipping. A man who perhaps should not be trusted with a scalpel anymore. And every single one of those notes carried my electronic signature and a timestamp. I sat and I stared at the timestamp on the Harold Pruitt note. It said the entry had been made at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in April. My hands went cold. Because I keep a calendar. I have kept the same kind of calendar for 30 years, a paper one written by hand, because I never trusted myself to a screen. And I knew without even looking that on Tuesday afternoons in the spring I was not at a computer. I was in an operating room. I pulled the calendar from my bag. April, that Tuesday, 2:17 in the afternoon. There it was in my own handwriting, a mitral valve repair scheduled for 1 o'clock. I had been elbow deep in another human being's chest at the exact moment I was supposedly sitting at a terminal, falsifying the record of a man I had already sent home healthy. I want to tell you that in that moment I felt vindicated, that I saw the crack in their story and knew I could break it open. But that is not what I felt. What I felt first was fear. Because if someone had gone to the trouble of attaching my signature to a note I could prove I did not write, then this was not a mistake. This was not a crossed chart or a clerical error. This was a person, a careful and patient person, who had decided to end me. And they had been doing it for over a year, one small entry at a time while I toasted them with wine and slept soundly one floor above. I scrolled through the access logs for the Pruitt chart looking for the name of whoever had made that entry. But the system only told me what I already feared. The change had been made by an authorized user with full departmental clearance. It did not print a name. It did not need to. There was only one person in that department with the access and the reason and the midnight hours to do this. I sat back in the chair and let that land. For 26 years, I had shared a bed with this woman. I had held her hand at 3 funerals. I had learned the particular way she took her coffee, the songs she hummed, while she cooked the exact weight of her head against my shoulder when she fell asleep during a movie. And in all that time, some part of her had been capable of this. Not a moment of weakness, not a crime of passion. A slow, deliberate, methodical campaign, spread across more than a year, requiring her to come home each night and eat dinner across from the man she was quietly destroying and smile at him and ask how his day had been. I tried to imagine the version of Vivian who could do that, and the frightening thing was that I could not. The woman I knew could not have done this, which meant the woman I knew had never fully existed. And then I saw something else. Buried in the activity history of the account, a small notification I had scrolled past a dozen times without reading. A voicemail transcript flagged to my inbox 14 months earlier and never opened. I clicked it. It was from a nurse named Dana Whitfield, a young woman who had worked our floor for 2 years, and then I now recalled resigned suddenly and without explanation the previous winter. The transcript was short. "Dr. Hastings, it's Dana. I need to talk to you about something privately when you have a minute. It's about some of the charts. I don't want to make a thing of it if I'm wrong, but please call me back. It's important." The message was dated the week after Harold Pruitt's chart was altered. I read it 4 times. I remembered that week. I remembered being buried in surgeries, a conference in Atlanta, a backlog of consults. I remembered seeing Dana's name on a message and thinking I will call her back when things slow down. I never called her back. Things never slowed down. And 2 months later, Dana Whitfield handed in her resignation and left the state, and I never once wondered why. She had seen it. 14 months ago, a 28-year-old nurse had noticed something wrong in the charts and tried to bring it to me, and I had been too busy saving lives to save my own. I put my head in my hands at that kitchen table, and I understood for the first time the full and lonely shape of what was happening to me. Someone I loved had built a trap around me over the course of a year. Someone else had tried to warn me, and I had ignored her. And the only proof I had that I was innocent was a single line in a paper calendar that any one of them could call a coincidence. Upstairs, I heard the floorboards creak. Vivian was awake. I heard her cross the hall, heard the bathroom light click on, heard the ordinary sounds of the woman I had married moving through the house we had shared for 2 decades. And I sat very still in the dark kitchen, my innocence in one hand and my terror in the other. And I did not yet know that by the following morning, the last thing that still belonged to me, my name, on the door of an operating room would be taken away for good. The letter came by courier the next morning, which told me everything about how seriously they were taking this. Hospitals do not send couriers for small matters. A young man in a windbreaker handed me an envelope on my own front porch, asked me to sign for it, and drove away before I had it open. Inside was a single page from hospital counsel. My administrative leave was now formal. My surgical privileges were suspended pending the outcome of the review, which could take months. I was not to enter the surgical floor access patient records or contact staff regarding the investigation. At the bottom was a line instructing me to return my hospital identification and my keys to the facilities office by the end of the day. I read it standing in the doorway in my robe. Vivian had already left for her shift. She had made coffee, I noticed. 2 cups the way she always did, though only one was gone. The other sat cooling on the counter, waiting for a man whose entire life had just been suspended by courier. I poured it down the sink. I could have mailed the badge back. I want you to understand that. There was no rule that said I had to return it in person. But I got dressed, and I drove to the hospital one last time because some stubborn part of me needed to walk those halls while I was still allowed to, before the man who belonged there became a man who used to. The facilities office was in the basement near the loading dock, and I handed my badge and my keys to a clerk named Rosa, who had checked me in and out of that building for 15 years. She would not meet my eyes either. She just slid a form across the counter and murmured that she was sorry Dr. Hastings, and I could hear in her voice that she meant it. And somehow that was worse than the boardroom. The board had decided I was guilty. Rosa still believed in me, and there was nothing her belief could do. On my way out, I did something I was not supposed to do. I took the elevator up to the 3rd floor to the surgical wing, one last time. My badge no longer opened the doors, but a resident was coming out as I approached, and he held it for me out of habit, out of respect, not knowing he was letting a suspended man onto a floor he had been banned from. I thanked him. He had no idea. The operating rooms were quiet that early. Between cases, the surgical wing has a stillness you find nowhere else in a hospital, a held breath. I walked to the end of the hall, to operating room 4, the one I had used most often for 3 decades, and I looked through the small window in the door. It was empty and clean, the table bare under the great round lights, the instrument trays covered everything, waiting for the next surgeon. For 30 years, that next surgeon had so often been me. I pushed the door open, and I went inside. I should not have. But I stood there in the cold, clean air of that room, and I looked at the table where I had opened so many chests and closed them again, where I had held hearts in my hands and coaxed them back to rhythm, where I had given families their fathers and mothers and children back. And without thinking, without deciding to, I reached over to the box on the wall and I drew out a pair of surgical gloves. I began to pull one on, the familiar snap of latex against my wrist. The motion I had made 10,000 times, the motion my hands knew better than they knew anything. And then I stopped. One glove on one glove in my hand. Because there was nothing to do. There was no patient on the table. There was no team scrubbing in beside me. There was no reason on earth for a suspended surgeon to be standing in an empty operating room with a glove half on, and I understood in that moment more completely than the courier's letter had made me understand it, that this was over. Not just the accusation, not just the review. This, the thing I was. I peeled the glove off slowly, and I set both of them on the edge of the table, and I stood there in the silence a while longer, because I did not know who I would be when I walked back out that door. My father had been a doctor too, a country physician in a small town in East Tennessee. He was the kind of doctor who took a sack of tomatoes as payment when a family could not manage cash, who drove out at 3 in the morning for a child's fever and never sent a bill for the trip. People loved him. And then when I was 14, an old man died a week after my father treated him for pneumonia, and the family decided my father had been careless, had missed something, had let their grandfather slip away. He had not. I knew even then that he had not. I had seen him agonize over that patient, seen him drive back out twice to check on a man who was simply old and simply dying. But the family needed someone to blame, and my father was there. Rather than fight them, rather than defend himself, he simply absorbed it. He believed, as he had raised me to believe, that a good man does not need to shout his own innocence, that the truth would come out in time and vindicate the patient man. The truth never came out. The town believed the accusation because he never argued with it, and half his patients drifted to the younger doctor 2 towns over, and he spent the last years of his career under a shadow that was never his. I watched a proud, gentle man grow quiet and small. He died with that unearned shame still on him, and at his funeral, I heard 2 people in low voices repeat the very lie that had followed him for 20 years. I had watched him carry it all the way to his grave, and standing at that graveside I had promised myself I would never let a thing like that happen to me. And yet here I was, standing in an empty room where I no longer belonged, having said almost nothing in my own defense, doing exactly what my father had done, keeping my head down, trusting the truth to take care of itself. I left the operating room. I took the stairs, not the elevator. And as I reached the ground floor, a voice behind me, smooth and warm and entirely unhurried, called out my name. "Elliot," it said. My God. I only just heard. Do you have a minute? I turned around, and there, in an immaculate gray suit, wearing an expression of practiced sympathy, was the last man on earth I wanted to see. And I did not yet know that he was the second half of everything that had been done to me. Grant Kessler was the chief executive of Ashcombe Regional, and in the 15 years he had run the place, I had exchanged perhaps a dozen real conversations with him. He was not a doctor. He had come up through hospital administration, through mergers and margins and board presentations, and he wore his authority the way some men wear cologne, a little too much of it, noticeable the moment he entered a room. He was tall and silver-haired and impeccably dressed, and he had the particular gift, common to powerful men, of making you feel that his attention was a gift he was choosing to give you. "Walk with me," he said, and put a hand on my shoulder, steering me gently toward the atrium. "I want you to know I fought this. I want you to know that." I did not answer. Something in me had gone very still and very alert, the way it used to in the operating room when a patient's numbers began to drift for no reason I could see yet. "The board's hands are tied," he went on. "The moment a formal complaint like this is filed, the review is automatic. Compliance insurance, the lawyers, everybody has a protocol, and the protocol doesn't care about 30 years of service. It's a machine, Elliot. I hate it as much as you do." He shook his head with an expression of deep, sorrowful regret. It was a very good expression. He had clearly used it many times. "But between you and me, off the record, I have every confidence this gets sorted out. These things usually do. You just have to be patient. Let the process work. Let the process work." My father could have said that. The truth will take care of itself. I was so tired of that sentence. And here it was again, in the mouth of a man in a $2,000 suit. We reached the atrium, all glass, and light a fountain burbling in the center of it. Grant guided me to a bench, but did not sit, so I did not either. He stood close, his voice dropping into a register of confidentiality. "Can I give you some advice, man to man?" He didn't wait for permission. "Don't make this a war. I've seen doctors in your position get angry, hire lawyers, start pointing fingers, and I'm telling you, it never helps. It just makes the process longer and uglier, and it makes people wonder what you're so afraid of. The best thing you can do, the strongest thing, is stay quiet. Cooperate. Let it run its course. Fighting only makes you look guilty." He said it kindly. That was the thing I kept noticing, the kindness of it, the warmth wrapped around every word. In 30 years of medicine, I had learned to read the faces of frightened people, families in waiting rooms, patients being told the worst. And I had learned that real concern is a little clumsy. It stumbles. It does not know what to do with its hands. What Grant Kessler was giving me was too smooth to be clumsy. It was concern that had been rehearsed. And a rehearsed feeling is not a feeling at all. It is a performance, and a performance requires a reason. And there it was. So smooth, I almost missed it. He was not comforting me, he was managing me. Every sentence underneath its warmth carried the same instruction. Stay quiet. Don't fight. Don't look too closely. Do exactly what my fathers did, what I had promised myself I would never do. A man who genuinely believed in my innocence would have told me to fight like hell. Only a man with something to protect would work this hard to keep me still. I felt something then, that I was not used to feeling, something that went against every instinct my father had planted in me. I felt suspicion. Not grief, not confusion, not the drowning helplessness of the last 2 days, but a cold, clear, focused wariness, the same clarity I had always found standing over an open chest with a life in the balance. For the first time since that Thursday morning, I was not a victim reeling from a blow. I was a man beginning very quietly to hunt. I studied his face, then really studied it, and I asked him a simple question. Grant, who filed the complaint. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered behind those sympathetic eyes. "You know, I can't tell you that," he said. "It's confidential, protected." So I understand. I'm only asking because the notes in those charts were added on days I was in surgery. So whoever filed the complaint is either mistaken or they know something about how those entries got there. I kept my voice mild, curious, the voice of a reasonable man thinking out loud. It seems like the kind of thing an investigation would want to look at very carefully. The change in him was almost invisible. A slight tightening at the corner of the mouth, a half-second too long before he answered. And then the sympathy came back down over his face like a curtain. "That's exactly the kind of thing you should save for the review, Elliot. Not for the hallway. Getting ahead of the process, making accusations, it never plays well." He clapped me once on the arm. "Take care of yourself. Get some rest. And please, for your own sake, let us handle this the right way." He walked away across the bright atrium, unhurried greeting, a passing administrator with a warm laugh, a man entirely at ease in his kingdom. And I stood by the fountain and watched him go, and I turned his words over one by one, and I realized that he had made a small mistake. I had never told him that the notes were added on days I was in surgery. That detail was not in any letter I had received. It was something I had discovered the night before, alone at my own kitchen table, going through records I was no longer supposed to have access to. There were only two ways Grant Kessler could have known that I would be able to prove those timestamps were wrong. Either he had read my private complaint file in extraordinary detail, or he already knew exactly when those charts had been altered and by whom, because he had been there when the plan was made. I did not know yet which of those was true. But I knew standing alone by that fountain that the trap around me was bigger than one woman working alone at midnight. My wife had the keys, but someone had told her which doors to open. And I was beginning to suspect I had just shaken his hand. There was one person in the world I was certain would stand with me, and that was my daughter. Emily was 24, a second-year resident at Ashcombe, following the path I had walked before her, and Vivian had walked beside me. She had my hands, everyone said, steady and unhurried, and she had her mother's eyes, which I tried not to think about now. When she was small, she used to sit in my lap while I read her the names of surgical instruments out of an old textbook, like they were characters in a fairy tale, forceps and retractors and clamps, and she would repeat them back solemnly, a tiny girl learning the language of her father's world. I had never in my life doubted that Emily loved me, and I had never imagined a version of the future in which she would look at me the way she looked at me that afternoon. I found her in the residence lounge on the second floor. I was not supposed to be in the building, but I was past caring about that. She was alone, thankfully, a cup of coffee going cold beside her charts open on the table. When she saw me in the doorway, she did not get up. That was the first thing I noticed. My daughter, who ran to hug me across parking lots, who called me every Sunday, who still signed her texts with a little heart, did not stand up. "Dad," she said, "you shouldn't be here." "I know. I needed to see you. I needed to tell you myself before you heard it all twisted around." I sat down across from her, and I reached for her hand, and she let me take it, but her fingers did not close around mine. "Emily, whatever they are saying about me, whatever your mother has told you, none of it is true. I did not falsify those charts. I have never in my life falsified a chart. Someone did this to me." She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw that her eyes were red, that she had been crying. And I understood that this was already an old grief to her. She had cried about this before she ever saw me. Someone had gotten to her first. "Mom told me you'd say that," she said quietly. The words landed like a blow. "What?" "She said you'd come to me, and you'd tell me it was all a setup, that someone was out to get you. She said you've been struggling for a while, Dad, that you've been forgetful, defensive, that she's been covering for you at work for months because she didn't want anyone to see how bad it had gotten." Emily pulled her hand back gently and folded both of hers in her lap. "She's devastated. Do you understand that she's been carrying this alone, trying to protect you, trying to protect your career, and now it's all come out anyway, and she's the one everyone's whispering about, the wife who covered for him." I sat there, and I listened to my own destruction told back to me in my daughter's voice, and it was the most masterful thing I have ever encountered. Vivian had not painted herself as my accuser. That would have been clumsy. She had painted herself as my protector, the loyal wife quietly shielding her failing husband until the truth grew too large to hide. It explained everything. Her silence in the boardroom became loyalty. My innocence became denial. My defense became exactly the symptom she had predicted. Every move I might make to prove myself would only confirm the story she had already planted in the one heart I could not bear to lose. "On Emily," I said, and I could hear my own voice shaking, and I hated it. "Look at me. In your whole life, have I ever once been forgetful, defensive? Have you ever one single time seen me struggle to do my work?" She was quiet. And in that quiet, I saw something move behind her eyes. Some flicker of the girl who knew her father wrestling with the story she had been handed. "People change, Dad," she said, but there was less certainty in it now. Stress does things. You're not young anymore. Is that you talking, or is that your mother? It was the wrong thing to say. Her face closed like a door. "Don't," she said. "Don't you dare turn this on her. She has done nothing but love you and cover for you, and you're standing here on the worst week of her life trying to convince me she's some kind of villain. Do you hear yourself? This is exactly what she said you'd do." I had nothing to answer that with, because there was no answer. Vivian had built a perfect machine, one in which my every truthful word became further proof of my guilt, and the harder I pushed against it, the tighter it closed around me. I could feel my father's whole life pressing down on me in that moment, the terrible wisdom of his silence, the way fighting a lie can make you look exactly like the liar. But then Emily said something that stayed with me long after I left that room. She said it almost to herself, looking down at the table as if she were trying to talk herself back onto solid ground. "I told her it didn't add up," she murmured. "The Alvarado chart. I was on that case, Dad. I did the post-op rounds myself, and the note about the missed dose, I told Mom that isn't how I remember it. And she got this look, and she said I must be misremembering, that I was too close to it, because you're my father." Emily shook her head slowly. She said residents see what they want to see. I went very still, because my daughter had just told me, without knowing it, two things at once. That some part of her did not believe the story, and that when she had voiced her doubt, my wife had moved immediately, expertly, to talk her out of her own memory. That is not what a grieving, loyal wife does. That is what someone does when they cannot afford a witness. I did not say any of this. It was too soon, and Emily was too raw, and I knew that if I seized on it, she would only close the door harder. So I filed it away the way you note a shadow on a scan that the patient is not ready to hear about yet. I stood up slowly. "I love you," I said. "I have never once in 24 years given you a reason not to trust me. I'm asking you to remember that. That's all. Just remember who I've been. And Emily, whatever you decide about me, hold on to what you saw on that Alvarado chart. Your own eyes. Don't let anyone talk you out of your own eyes." She did not answer. She looked down at her cold coffee and her open charts, and she would not look at me, and in that refusal she was so exactly her mother in the boardroom that I had to leave before she could see what it did to me. I drove home through the gold October light, with my hands steady on the wheel and my chest full of something with no name. I had lost my career in 2 days, but sitting at that red light on West End Avenue watching a father lift his laughing daughter onto his shoulders on the sidewalk, I understood that my career was not the thing they could take from me that would end me. There was only one of those, and she had just told me I shouldn't be there. Vivian came home a little after 7 that evening, and I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I made dinner. I want to explain why, because from the outside it must look insane. My wife had spent more than a year building a case to destroy me. She had turned my daughter against me. She had stood in a boardroom and let them take my life's work without a word of defense. And that night, I stood at our stove, and I made her the chicken dish she liked with the lemon and the capers, because I had understood something driving home. If she knew that I knew the game would change, she would stop being careless. She would stop leaving things where I might find them. My only advantage, the single card I held, was that she still believed I was exactly what my father had been. A patient man. A man who would keep his head down and wait for the truth to save him. A man who would never fight back. So I would let her keep believing it. For a little while longer, I would be that man on the outside, while underneath I became someone else entirely. She was tired when she came in, and softer than she had been in the boardroom, and for a disorienting moment, she was simply my wife again, kicking off her shoes, complaining about a double shift, telling me some small story about a nurse who had quit without notice. I set a plate in front of her. I poured her a glass of wine, and I watched her eat the dinner I had made, and I marveled in a cold and distant way at how completely a person can live inside a lie. There was no strain in her, no guilt that I could see. She asked me how I was holding up, and there was real tenderness in it, or something that had learned to look exactly like tenderness, and that was somehow the most frightening thing of all. She had not hardened herself against me. She simply felt nothing where the feeling was supposed to be. After dinner, she went up to shower, and I sat alone at the kitchen table in the quiet, and I let myself feel it, just for a moment, the full size of what was gone. 26 years. The yellow paint. The warm coin in my pocket. The girl on my lap learning the names of instruments. I did not cry. I have never been able to cry when I most needed to. My grief has always come out sideways in strange, small tasks. So instead I got up and I did the thing I always did before bed, the thing I had done every night of our marriage. I set up the coffee for the morning. I filled the machine. I took down 2 cups from the cabinet and set them side by side on the counter the way I had 10,000 times hers on the left with the chip in the handle mine on the right. And I stood there looking at those 2 cups in the dark kitchen, and something in me went very quiet and very cold. Because I did not know anymore if there would ever again be a morning in this house with 2 cups on the counter. I did not know if the woman upstairs was my wife or the most dangerous stranger I had ever met. I reached out, and after a moment I put her cup back in the cabinet. Just mine then. 1 cup on the right. It was such a small thing. It nearly broke me. That was the night I stopped waiting. I went into my study, and I closed the door, and I did not turn on the overhead light, only the small lamp on the desk. I took out a legal pad, and at the top of the first page I wrote 3 names: Harold Pruitt, Denise Alvarado, Walter Boyd. Under them I wrote a 4th, Dana Whitfield. And under that, after a moment, I wrote 2 more and drew a line connecting them. Vivian. Grant. For 30 years I had solved problems the same way, whether it was a failing heart or a diagnostic puzzle. You do not panic. You do not guess. You gather what is true, one verified fact at a time, and you follow it wherever it goes, even when it goes somewhere you do not want to be. I had a paper calendar that put me in an operating room when a lie said I was at a keyboard. I had a voicemail from a frightened young nurse who had seen something 14 months ago. I had a chief executive who knew a detail he should not have known. And I had my daughter's own eyes on the Alvarado chart telling her a story that did not match the record. It was not enough. Not nearly enough to walk into a review board and overturn a year of careful lies. A paper calendar could be dismissed. A voicemail could be explained away. My suspicions about Grant were just that, suspicions. To prove what had been done to me, I needed something no one could argue with. I needed to catch the alteration happening. I needed to see with my own eyes a record of who sat down at a terminal in the dead of night and rewrote a patient's chart. And everything in that hospital ran through the same electronic system. The very system my wife controlled. The very system that would only ever tell me that an authorized user had made a change. If the proof existed anywhere, it existed somewhere that system could not reach and Vivian could not scrub. Somewhere old. Somewhere forgotten. I did not know yet that such a place existed, but I knew where a man went to ask that kind of question. Not to the doctors, not to the board. To the one person in any hospital who actually knows how the building remembers things. I picked up my phone and I scrolled to a name I had not called in years. A man who had fixed my office computer a dozen times and never once made me feel like a fool for not understanding it. Ray Delgado. Maintenance and systems. 31 years in that building. Longer than me. I typed out a message in the lamplight. Ray, it's Elliot Hastings. I need to ask you something quietly off the books. Are you around tomorrow? And I sat there in the dark, with my one coffee cup waiting in the kitchen, and my whole ruined life spread across a legal pad, and for the first time in 3 days, I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a surgeon again, standing at the edge of something hidden about to cut. Ray Delgado answered my message within the hour. Same as ever. Come by the shop tomorrow, lunchtime, side entrance. Bring coffee. He had spelled coffee wrong the way he always did, and something about that small, familiar error steadied me more than anything had in days. The maintenance and systems office was in the sub-basement, past the loading dock down a corridor most doctors never saw in their entire careers. I went in the side door at noon, carrying 2 coffees, and I found Ray exactly where he had been for 31 years, at a workbench surrounded by open server towers and coils of cable and 3 monitors showing scrolling lines of text I could not read. He was heavier and grayer than when I had last really looked at him, but he had the same unhurried calm, the calm of a man who has never once been impressed by a title. "You're Dr. Hastings," he said, and then he looked at my face and corrected himself. "Elliot, sit down. You look like hell." I sat, and I told him. Not all of it, not Vivian, not Grant, not yet. But the shape of it. 3 charts altered. My signature attached to notes I did not write. Timestamps that placed me at a keyboard when my calendar placed me in surgery. A career suspended over records I had been locked out of. Ray listened without interrupting, sipping the coffee, and when I finished, he set the cup down and was quiet for a while. It was a strange thing sitting in that basement asking for help. For 30 years, I had been the one people came to. The one who knew things, who fixed things, whose steady hands were the last hope in a bad night. I had built my whole identity on being the man who did not need anyone. My father had taught me that too, without meaning to. A good man handles his own troubles quietly. He does not go around asking. And here I was, doing the very thing I had spent my life avoiding. Sitting across from a man I had barely spoken to in years, admitting that I could not save myself, that I did not even understand the machine that had convicted me. It should have felt like weakness. Instead, oddly, it felt like the first honest thing I had done in a long time. "So you want to know who really made those entries," he said. "Not what the system says. Who?" "Yes." He blew out a long breath. "That's the problem, isn't it? The clinical record system, the new, it logs a user ID and a clearance level. That's it, by design. Somebody with department admin makes a change. All it saves is admin made a change. No name, no workstation, nothing you could take to a lawyer." He shook his head. "And here's the worst part. Somebody with that level of access can also go into the audit trail and clean it up. Prune it. Change a timestamp on the change itself. If your person knew what they were doing and had the clearance, the electronic record is a dead end. It'll only ever tell you what they want it to tell you." I felt the floor drop a little. This was what Grant had been counting on, I understood. This was why he was so calm. The system that had convicted me was the same system that would protect them, and it was locked in my wife's hands. "But," Ray said, and he held up one thick finger, and there was the faintest gleam in his eye. "You're asking the systems guy." And the systems guy has been fighting the people who run this hospital for 20 years about exactly this. They love their shiny cloud. Everything backed up to a server farm in Virginia, everything encrypted, everything modern. And every year they tell me to decommission the old stuff. And every year I tell them yes, and every year I don't. What old stuff? He stood and beckoned me deeper into the room, to a corner where an ancient steel rack held equipment that looked a decade older than everything around it. When I started here, the whole building ran on a closed-circuit system. Cameras, door logs, terminal activity, all of it recorded to physical drives right here in this room. No internet, no cloud. Just tape, and then later local hard disks. When they modernized, they cut most of it over to the new networked system. But some of the old recorders in the back hallways, the storage wing, the after-hours workstations, nobody ever bothered to physically unplug them. They're not connected to anything. They just sit here quietly writing to these drives the way they have for years, because taking them out means paperwork and budget approvals, and nobody wants to be the guy who signs off on it. He patted the top of the steel rack almost tenderly. The hospital forgot these exist, which means the person who altered your charts almost certainly forgot too. I stared at the humming rack of old machines. You're telling me there might be a recording? I'm telling you that if somebody sat down at one of the after-hours terminals in the old wing late at night, when they thought the only cameras were the networked ones they could wipe, then maybe there's a set of eyes they didn't know about. He looked at me steadily. The overnight documentation workstation, the one in the archive corridor on the 4th floor, that old unit still feeds down here. If your charts were changed after hours and I had to guess they were, that's where it would have happened. Away from the day staff. Quiet. The archive corridor, 4th floor. The overnight documentation workstation. The very machine a person overseeing documentation integrity would have every innocent reason to use at any hour without a single soul questioning why. Ray, I said carefully, how far back do those old drives keep a recording? He scratched his jaw. The good ones close to a year before they write over themselves. Some longer. Then he saw something in my face, some calculation, and his own expression sobered. Elliot, whatever this is, whoever this is, you sure you want to see it? Because once you look at something like this, you can't unsee it. And from the look on your face when you walked in here, I don't think you came down to my shop about a stranger. I did not answer him. I could not. Because he was right. And we both knew it. Somewhere in this warm, humming room on a forgotten drive, the hospital did not even remember owning, there might be a recording of exactly who had spent the last 14 months dismantling my life one midnight entry at a time. And I already knew with a cold and terrible certainty whose face I was afraid to see when the tape began to play. Ray needed a day to pull the old drives without drawing attention. Doing it during his shift with cameras of his own overhead and a supervisor who checked in was not simple. We agreed I would come back Thursday night after the day staff cleared out when he could work the archived footage in peace. In the meantime, he told me to do one thing. Go back into the clinical system if I still could and pull the original versions of the 3 charts. Not the altered ones. The underlying record, the version before the notes were added. If we could show the old footage of the alteration and match it against the clean original. He said we would have something no lawyer on earth could wave away. So that night I sat down at my home computer, and I logged in, and I discovered that the ground had shifted again beneath my feet. My access was gone. That was expected. They had finally caught up with the suspension. But I still had one back door, a research login tied to a teaching study I had run 2 years earlier, an old credential the compliance office had never thought to revoke. It got me in. And when it did, I went straight for the audit history of the Harold Pruitt chart, the full version, every entry and every revision since the day he was admitted. It was empty, not altered. Empty. The revision history had been wiped clean, where there should have been a record of every change ever made to that chart, a complete chain going back to the original. There was now only the current version, the false one presented as though it had always been the truth. The same was true of Nice Alvarado. The same was true of Walter Boyd. Someone had gone into the deepest layer of those records and erased the entire history, so that no one could ever compare the lie to what had come before. And the wipe was dated 3 days earlier. I sat back and did the arithmetic, and it turned my blood to ice. 3 days earlier. That was the day after the board meeting. The day I went back to the hospital, turned in my badge, and stood in an empty operating room. The day I spoke to Grant Kessler by the fountain and let slip like a fool that I could prove the timestamps put me in surgery. I had told him in my own reasonable voice, thinking myself clever, that the record would clear me. And within days, the record had been scrubbed to the bone. They were watching me. Not in some vague, paranoid way. Specifically. My movements, my words, my access. The moment I had shown my hand to Grant, someone had gone into the system and destroyed the one thing that could have proven my innocence cleanly. Which meant 2 things, and I made myself look at both of them squarely. It meant Grant was certainly part of it. The timing was no coincidence. And it meant that whoever had wiped those histories had the same top-level clearance my wife had, and had used it 3 days ago while I sat in my study writing names on a legal pad and imagining I was 1 step ahead. I was not 1 step ahead. I had never been. I had been exactly where they wanted me, saying exactly what they expected, and every clever move I thought I was making had only told them what to erase next. I got up from the desk, and I walked through my own house, then slowly room by room, and it had become a foreign country. Here was the couch where Vivian and I had watched 100 Sunday movies, her head on my shoulder. Here was the photograph on the hall table, the 3 of us at Emily's white coat ceremony, all of us smiling. And moving through it now, I felt like a man walking through the wreckage of a house that had burned down years ago without his ever noticing the fire. Somewhere in these rooms, my wife had planned all of this. She had lain beside me in our bed and worked out in her mind how to take my name, my work, my daughter, and leave me with nothing. I had thought this house was my home. It had been for at least a year the headquarters of the campaign against me. The old feeling rose up in me then, the drowning one, the helplessness of that first Thursday. What was the point? They controlled the system. They controlled my daughter. They controlled the narrative in every hallway of that hospital, and now they had erased the last clean copy of the truth. A patient man would give up here. A patient man would tell himself that fighting a machine this large only made him look guilty, that the wise thing was to accept the ruin quietly and preserve what dignity he could. I heard my father's voice in it, gentle and defeated. Let it go, son. Let the truth take care of itself, and it stays buried forever, unless someone who loves it enough is willing to go down into the dark and dig it out. They had wiped the clean copy. Fine. They had been thorough, and they had been fast, and they had been 1 move ahead of me the whole time. But they had made one assumption, the same comfortable assumption everyone had made about me my entire life. They assumed I would keep looking in the places they controlled. The clinical system, the audit trail, the official record. They did not know that a heavy gray, unhurried man in a basement had spent 31 years refusing to unplug the machines the hospital had forgotten. They did not know about the drives humming in the corner of Ray Delgado's shop, writing quietly to themselves, remembering everything connected to nothing they could reach. They had erased the record. but they could not erase the memory of a building that no longer knew it was remembering. I closed the laptop. I did not panic, and I did not despair, though both were close at hand. Instead, I did what I had done 10,000 times before a difficult case. I slept a few hours. I ate. I steadied my hands. And on Thursday evening, 1 full week after the worst morning of my life, I drove back to the hospital in the dark, parked where the cameras I knew about could not see me, and went in through the side door to watch a machine show me the truth about my wife. The sub-basement was different at night. During the day, it hummed under the noise of the hospital above it. But at 9 in the evening, the building had gone quiet, and down there the only sounds were the fans of the servers and the occasional tick of old metal cooling. Ray was waiting with the side door propped open and a thermos of coffee, and this time he did not tell me I looked like hell. He just looked at me for a moment, nodded once, and said, "I found it. The archive corridor recorder. The drive goes back almost 14 months. He paused. "Elliot, I stayed late last night and I did a first pass just to make sure the footage was readable before I dragged you down here for nothing. So I need to tell you before we start. It's readable." Something in the way he said it told me he had already seen, that he was giving me a last chance to walk away and not know. I did not take it. "Show me," I said. He led me to a workstation he had set up at the back. Away from the door, 2 monitors angled so no one passing the corridor window could see them. He had pulled the relevant nights, he explained, by cross-referencing the alteration dates from my own notes, the dates the false entries had been stamped with. 3 dates over 14 months. 3 late nights when someone had sat down at the overnight documentation workstation in the archive corridor and rewritten the story of my career. He had queued up the earliest one, the Harold Pruitt night. While he worked the controls, I stood behind him, and I looked around that strange, warm room, the racks of forgotten machines, faithfully remembering what the whole modern hospital had chosen to forget. Everyone upstairs trusted the cloud, the encryption, the sleek certainty of the new system, and all of it had been turned against me in an afternoon. And here in a basement, nobody visited on drives, nobody had bothered to unplug. The actual truth had been sitting quietly the whole time, waiting for someone to come down and ask. I thought of my father, of how he had trusted the truth to rise on its own, and how it never had. The truth had not risen. It had been here all along, underground in the dark, and it had taken a suspended man and a stubborn maintenance worker to come looking for it. The old cameras mounted high in the corner of the corridor, Ray said. Wide angle. You can see the whole workstation, the desk, the chair, the doorway. Picture's grainy, it's an old unit, but it's clear enough. He looked at me. You ready? I was not ready. I have opened a man's chest while his family wept in the waiting room, and I was more ready for that than I was for this. But I nodded, and Ray pressed play. The footage was black and white and slightly soft, the timestamp burning in the corner. 2:40 in the morning. An empty corridor, the workstation dark, the screen off. For a long moment, nothing happened, just the still gray geometry of a hallway asleep. And I realized I was holding my breath, and I realized what I was praying for, and I hated myself for it. Because underneath all the certainty, all the cold logic of the calendar and the timestamps and Grant's mistake, some foolish, loyal, 26-year part of me was still praying that when the figure appeared, it would be a stranger. That it would be some faceless hospital employee, some hired hand, anyone at all except her. That there would still be some version of this where the woman I had married was not the woman who had done this. I wanted the tape to be wrong. Even then. Even after everything. God help me, I wanted my wife back. At 2:41, a light came on in the corridor. motion at the edge of the frame. Someone was coming. A figure entered from the left, moving without hurry, the walk of someone who belonged there, someone who had no reason to fear being seen. Whoever it was reached the workstation and pulled out the chair and sat down back partly to the camera and reached for the keyboard. The screen glowed to life, washing the figure in pale light. A hand moved to the mouse. The other hand tucked a strand of hair behind an ear, an ordinary unconscious gesture. The kind of small human motion a person makes 10,000 times without thinking. I knew that gesture. I had watched that hand tuck that hair behind that ear across 26 years of breakfast tables and hospital galas and quiet evenings on the couch. My chest went tight. Ray beside me had gone very still. I started, and my voice did not sound like mine. Can you get the face? There's a better angle coming, Ray said quietly. She turns. About a minute in, something makes her look up toward the door. The camera catches her straight on. He had clearly watched this already. He knew exactly what was coming. Elliot, you can still tell me to stop. On the screen, the figure was working now, both hands moving over the keyboard with an easy fluency, entering something into the chart of a 71-year-old retired postal carrier who had walked out of my hospital healthy and sent me a photograph of a fish. Line by line in the dead of night, building the first small brick of the wall that would bury me. There was no hesitation in the movements, no guilt in the posture. Just quiet, competent, patient work. The work of someone very good at seeing everything and missing nothing. Manon, I said, don't stop! My eyes stayed fixed on that grainy screen, on the set of those shoulders, on the tilt of that head bent to its work. I had spent a career reading bodies, the language they speak when the mouth is silent, and everything in this one told me what I already knew and could not yet bear. The ease of it. The comfort. This was not a nervous intruder. This was a person entirely at home doing a familiar task in a familiar place. Whatever she was destroying up on that glowing screen, it did not weigh on her at all. And I thought with a grief so large it had gone almost calm that you cannot fake that. You can fake tears in a boardroom. You can fake tenderness across a dinner table. But you cannot fake the relaxed shoulders of someone who feels no guilt. The timestamp climbed. 2:43 in the morning. And on the screen, as if she had heard something, some sound out in the sleeping hospital. The figure at the workstation lifted her head and began slowly to turn toward the camera and the doorway and the light. And I leaned forward in that basement chair 1 week, after the worst morning of my life, and I made myself look at the face of the person who had destroyed me. She turned toward the light, and the camera caught her face. And it was Vivian. Of course it was Vivian. I had known it since the boardroom, known it in my bones, assembled the proof of it, fact by fact, over a week of sleepless nights. But knowing a thing and seeing it are two different countries, and I had never in my life crossed the border between them so violently. There she was, my wife, in grainy black and white, her face lifted toward some sound in the corridor. And for one held second, she looked almost directly into the forgotten camera she did not know was there. Her expression was not the mask of a villain. That was the thing that undid me. It was calm, faintly annoyed at the interruption. The everyday face of a woman doing paperwork late, wishing to be left alone to finish. She listened a moment, heard nothing more, and turned back to the screen, and her hands returned to the keyboard, and she went on quietly rewriting the record of a healthy man to make her husband look like a fraud. I do not know how long I sat there. Ray had the good grace to say nothing at all. He simply reached over and paused the footage, freezing her there, mid-motion, caught forever in the act. And then he sat back and let me have the silence. And the silence is what I remember most. Not rage. I had expected rage. I had braced for it the way you brace for a wave. But what came instead was a vast, level stillness, the stillness of a room after the last mourner has gone home. Because something was ending in me as I watched that frozen frame, and it was not my marriage, not exactly. My marriage, I understood now, had ended a long time ago, in 100 midnights I had slept through. What was ending in that basement was something smaller and more private. It was the last version of Vivian that still lived inside me. The woman covered in yellow paint. The sharp young nurse who caught my mistake and saved me from myself. The head on my shoulder during the Sunday movie. All of them, every Vivian I had ever loved, were dying in that grainy freeze frame, and I sat and I watched them go one after another, and I did not make a sound. I have thought a great deal since about why I did not weep in that basement. I think it is because grief needs a person to grieve, and I could no longer find the person. You can mourn someone who has died, but how do you mourn someone who it turns out was never quite who you thought they were? The Vivian on that screen had lived in my house for 26 years, worn my ring, raised my child, and somewhere behind her eyes had held a coldness I had never once suspected. I was not weeping for a wife who had died. I was reckoning with the fact that the wife I was weeping for had in some fundamental way never fully existed. And you cannot cry for a person who was never there. You can only sit very still in a humming basement and feel the shape of the empty place where you thought a life had been. I thought of our daughter. I thought of Emily folding her hands in her lap, telling me her mother was devastated. Her mother had been protecting me. Her mother was the one everyone was whispering about. I thought of how completely my child had been deceived, and how the woman on that screen had looked her own daughter in the eye and taught her to disbelieve her father. And somewhere under the stillness, very deep, the first ember of something harder than grief began quietly to glow. If you have ever loved someone for a long time and then watched them become a stranger in a single moment, you know, there is no word for what that costs. And if you are carrying something like that right now, some betrayal by a person who was supposed to be safe, then you already understand the question. I sat with in that basement, the question this whole story turns on. When the person who wronged you is someone you love, how much of yourself are you willing to burn down to make the truth known? I did not have an answer yet, but I had the footage. There are 2 more nights, Ray said gently after a long while. Alvarado and Boyd, same workstation. You want to see them, or is this enough? Play them, I said. My voice had gone flat and steady, the operating room voice, the one that does not shake no matter what is happening on the table. I need to know it's all her. I need to be sure. We watched the other 2. Denise Alvarado, 4 months later. The same corridor, the same unhurried walk, the same competent hands, my daughter's own patient, the chart Emily had trusted her own eyes about. And Walter Boyd, 2 months after that. 3 nights across 14 months, 3 patients I had healed, 3 lies built in the dark by the woman sleeping beside me. By the end, I was not praying anymore for the tape to be wrong. That prayer was dead. I was simply watching, cataloging. The way I would study a scan, gathering everything I would need. When it was over, Ray copied all of it twice onto 2 separate drives. He gave me one and kept the other. Belt and suspenders, he said. In case something happens to yours, or to you. He did not smile when he said it, and I understood he meant it. These were not people to underestimate. They had already erased the clean records the moment I got close. If they learned this footage existed, they would find a way to make it disappear too, and me, along with my credibility. Ray, I said as I stood to go the drive, heavy as a stone in my coat pocket. Why are you doing this? You could lose your job. You're 2 years from a pension. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the frozen image of my wife still glowing on the monitor. 20 years ago, he said, they blamed me for a data breach that was somebody upstairs cutting corners. I almost lost everything. One doctor stood up in a meeting and said it wasn't my fault, and he was right, and nobody remembers it but me. He looked at me. That was you, Elliot. You wouldn't remember. You were just telling the truth. But I've been waiting 20 years to pay it back. He nodded toward the door. Go home. Sleep if you can. Because tomorrow you have to decide what you're going to do with what you now know. And that, my friend, is going to be harder than watching the tape. He was right about that too. I went home that night with a hard drive in my coat pocket and my whole future inside it. And I lay down in bed beside the woman on the tape. I want you to sit with how strange that is, because I have never been able to fully explain it even to myself. Vivian was already asleep when I came in, or pretending to be. I undressed in the dark and I lay down on my side of the bed, the same side I had slept on for 26 years, and a foot away from me, breathing slow and even, was the person who had methodically dismantled my life. I could hear her. I could feel the small warmth of her across the space between us, and I lay there in the dark, and I did not know whether I wanted to shake her awake and scream, or simply weep into the pillow, or slip out of the house and never come back. So I did none of those things. I lay still and I stared at the ceiling, and I let the longest night of my life crawl past me 1 minute at a time. Sometime after 3 in the morning, she shifted in her sleep, and her hand fell across my chest, the way it had 1,000 times, a small unconscious gesture of a body that had shared a bed with mine for half its life. And I lay there frozen under the weight of that hand, the hand I had watched tuck a strand of hair behind an ear at 2 in the morning, while it rewrote a dying man's chart, and I felt something I am not proud of. For one long moment, I was tempted. Not to forgive her. I was past forgiveness. I was tempted to do nothing, because I could see very clearly the shape of the easy road. I could destroy the drive. I could let the review run its course, accept the ruin, quietly retire in disgrace. But with my marriage intact, my daughter's love intact, the terrible knowledge locked away where it could never hurt Emily. Vivian would win. She would keep her career, keep Grant, keep whatever she had done all this for. And I would keep the 2 things she had used as hostages against me from the start. My child. My home. I could simply be my father. Absorb the injustice. Carry the unearned shadow to my grave. And in exchange be allowed to keep sleeping in this bed with this hand on my chest, pretending until pretending became a kind of peace. I lay there and I understood finally why my father had done it. It was not weakness. I had spent my whole life thinking his silence was weakness, and lying there in the dark, I saw that I had been wrong. His silence had been love. He had swallowed a lie that cost him his good name, because fighting it would have cost his family more, would have meant years of ugliness, would have made his children grow up in a house at war. He had chosen us over his own vindication. He had died with a stranger's shame on him, so that we could grow up in peace. I had misjudged him my entire life. And now, at 3 in the morning, with my wife's hand on my chest, I was being offered the exact same bargain. And I finally understood how heavy it was, and how a good man could take it. But then I thought of Emily. I thought of my daughter standing in that residence lounge, red-eyed, telling me her father had grown forgetful and defensive, repeating her mother's careful poison, as though it were her own memory. I thought of the version of Emily who would grow up, who would build her whole life believing her father had been a fraud, a failing old man her devoted mother had loyally protected. That was the true cost of my silence. It was not just my name. If I did nothing, I would not be sparing my daughter pain. I would be handing her a lie to carry for the rest of her life, the same way the town had handed one to me about my father, the same way I had carried it wrongly, believing him weak right up until this very night. My father's silence had protected his children. My silence would poison mine. That was the difference, and it changed everything. I slid out from under Vivian's hand as gently as I could, and I got up and I went downstairs in the dark. I did not turn on the lights. I went to the hall closet, and I reached up to the high shelf where I kept the things that mattered too much to display. And I took down a worn leather bag cracked at the seams, the brass clasp gone soft and dull with age. My father's medical bag, the one he had carried out to farmhouses at 3 a.m. for 40 years, the one that had been beside his bed when he died. I had kept it all this time, and almost never opened it. Because opening it hurt. I sat down at the kitchen table in the dark, and I set the bag in front of me, and I ran my thumb over the old leather, and I spoke to him for the first time in years. I told him I understood now. I told him I was sorry I had thought him weak, and I told him that I was going to do the thing he never could not, because his way was wrong, but because my way had to be different, because the lie in my house was not the kind you could bury to protect a child. It was the kind that would bury the child instead. Then I did open the bag for the first time in many years. Inside was everything he had left, exactly as it was on the day he died. The old stethoscope, cracked tubing gone stiff, a reflex hammer worn smooth by his hand, and tucked in the side pocket, a folded square of paper I had forgotten was there. I opened it carefully. It was a line in his handwriting, shaky near the end of his life. "Do the right thing," it said, "and let the right thing be enough." He had believed that to his final breath, that doing right had been enough for him even when the world never gave him the credit. He had made peace with a truth that never came out. I could not. That was not a failing in him, and it was not a failing in me. It was simply that we had been handed different lies, and mine had a daughter attached to it. Outside, the first gray light was beginning to touch the maples. I sat with my father's bag until the sun came up, and when it did, I knew exactly what I was going to do. There was one question the footage could not answer, and it gnawed at me all that day. Why? I understood the how now completely. My wife, with her clearance and her midnight hours, had altered 3 charts and framed me. But a person does not spend 14 careful months destroying their own husband out of nowhere. There is always a reason underneath an engine driving it, and until I understood the engine, I did not truly understand my enemy. And I had learned, watching Grant Kessler lie to me by that fountain, that Vivian was not working alone. Someone had told her which doors to open. Someone had wiped the records the moment I got close. To defend myself, I could not just prove she had done it. I had to understand why, because a review board would ask the same question I was asking. Why would a devoted wife destroy a husband with no history of conflict if I could not answer that the tape would look like a mystery instead of a motive? So I went looking, and this time I knew better than to look in the places they controlled. I still had Ray, and Ray, it turned out, could see a great deal more than old hallway footage. Not patient records he was careful about, that he would not touch protected medical data. But the administrative side of the hospital, the scheduling systems, the access logs, the badge swipe records that tracked who entered which door and when, all of that ran through older infrastructure. He had spent 3 decades maintaining. It was not glamorous data. It was the boring exhaust of a large institution. But boring data does not lie because no one thinks to make it lie. I asked him a simple question. In the 14 months that those 3 charts were altered, could he show me the badge records for the archive corridor after hours, who came and went, and when? It took him 2 days. When he called me back to the basement, he had a printout, and his face was grim. "You were right to ask," he said. "Look, the pattern was there in black and white." On each of the 3 nights the charts were altered, Vivian's badge had entered the archive corridor in the small hours of the morning, just as the footage showed. But she was not the only one. On 2 of those 3 nights, a second badge had entered the same corridor within 20 minutes of hers, and left within 20 minutes of her leaving. The same badge both times. And when Ray matched the badge number to the personnel directory, the name that came up made the whole thing click into place with an almost audible sound. Grant Kessler, the chief executive of the hospital, had no earthly reason to be in an archive corridor at 2 in the morning. None. His office was on the top floor. His work was budgets and boards and donors. There was exactly one explanation for why his badge kept appearing in a forgotten hallway in the dead of night, minutes after my wife's. And it was not about spreadsheets. I sat with that printout in Ray's basement, and I felt the last piece turn over, and underneath my anger, beneath everything, there was a grief of a different kind. Because I understood finally that it had not even been about me. Not really. I had spent a week imagining that my wife hated me, that I had done something, failed her, somehow earned this. But I had not earned anything. I was not the target. I was the obstacle. Whatever was between Vivian and Grant, whatever they wanted, I had simply been standing in the way of it, a fixture to be removed, no more personal than a wall you knock down to widen a room. 26 years of marriage, and in the end, I had not even been worth hating. I had only been worth clearing away. That is a strange and terrible thing to learn about yourself at 54, that the person you built your life around did not feel enough about you even to be angry. Hatred, at least, is a kind of attention. Hatred would have meant I still mattered. But this was worse than hatred. This was indifference dressed up as love for as long as the love was useful. She had kissed me goodnight and asked about my day, all while I was to her a logistical problem with a solution date. I thought of every tender moment of the last 2 years and had to reconsider each one, wondering which had been real and which had been maintenance. The careful upkeep of a machine she needed running smoothly until the day she switched it off. She had taken from me not just my future, but my past, because now I could not trust a single memory of my own marriage. "There's more," Ray said quietly, and he slid another page across the bench. I pulled the departmental restructuring proposals. Public record board minutes, anybody can request them, they're just buried. Kessler's been pushing a plan for 2 years to consolidate the surgical department. Bring in a new outside director, streamline the senior staff. He tapped the page. "You're named in here, Elliot. Not by name, but you're the senior surgeon, whose contract and reputation were the main obstacle to the whole reorganization. With you gone, discredited, no severance, no fight, the restructuring goes through clean. And the head nurse who helped make it happen." He looked up at me. "She's listed as the recommended clinical liaison for the new director. It's a promotion, a big one. Money, title, a seat at the table she never had." So there it was. The engine. Not passion, though there was clearly that too. Not even simple hatred. It was smaller and colder than either. It was ambition and opportunity, and a marriage that had become to Vivian nothing but a door standing between her and the thing she wanted. Grant offered her a future. I was the price of admission, and she had paid it without, as far as I could tell, losing a single night's sleep. I gathered the pages together, and I stood up. I had the how now, and I had the why. I had a face on a tape, and a motive on a printout, and a second badge in a midnight corridor that turned one woman's crime into a conspiracy. It was at last enough. Enough to walk back into that boardroom and turn the whole thing over. But there was one person who deserved to hear it before the board did. One person who had been lied to worse than anyone who had been taught to disbelieve her own eyes. And I was not going to let her find out the way I had in a cold room from a stranger. Whatever it cost me, my daughter was going to hear the truth from her father. I asked Emily to meet me at a diner off Hillsborough Road. A quiet place neither of us had any memories in, because I did not want this to happen anywhere that mattered. She almost did not come. I could hear it in her voice on the phone, the wariness, the fear that I was going to put her in the middle again. But I told her I would only ask for 20 minutes, and that after those 20 minutes she never had to see me again if she did not want to. And something in that made her agree. She slid into the booth across from me with her arms already crossed, a young woman braced for a fight. She looked so much like her mother in that moment that it nearly stopped my heart. "I told Mom I was seeing a friend," she said. "So whatever this is, please make it quick." I looked at my daughter across that Formica table, and I felt a fear I had not felt watching the tape, had not felt facing the board, had not felt lying awake beside Vivian. Because everything else I had already lost. My career, my marriage, my name, all of it was gone or going, and a man can survive the loss of those things. But sitting across from Emily, I understood that I was about to gamble the one thing I had left. If the truth about her mother was more than she could carry, I might save my reputation and lose my child in the saving of it. I had spent my life believing the truth was always the right choice. Sitting in that booth for the first time, I was not sure. I only knew I could not build the rest of our lives on the same lie that had nearly buried me. I did not argue with her. I did not plead. I had learned that much. Instead, I set a laptop on the tables between us, turned so she could see the screen, and I told her the truth in the flattest, gentlest voice I owned. "Emily, I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm just going to show you some things, and then you can decide for yourself. That's all I've ever wanted, for you to decide for yourself with your own eyes." I paused. "You remember what you told me about the Alvarado chart? That the note about the missed dose wasn't how you remembered it. Hold on to that while you watch this." And I pressed play. I watched my daughter's face instead of the screen. I had seen the footage. I did not need to see it again. What I needed to see was her. I watched her lean in with a frown, expecting, I think, some grainy nothing she could dismiss. I watched her recognize the archive corridor. I watched the exact moment the figure walked into frame, and I watched her go very still, and I watched her lips part slightly as the woman at the workstation lifted her head and turned toward the camera and became unmistakably, undeniably her mother. "That's the Alvarado night," I said quietly. "The chart you did the rounds on. The one you knew was wrong." She did not say anything. She reached out with one finger and touched the screen, as if she could reach through it, as if the image might change if she pressed hard enough. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying yet. She was somewhere past crying, in the place where the mind refuses a thing even as it accepts it. "There are 2 other nights," I said. 2 other patients. The same corridor, the same workstation, the same. I can show you all of it. Or you can take my word for it now, because I have never lied to you, not once in 24 years, and I am not lying to you now." "Stop," she whispered. "Just stop for a second." I stopped. I let her sit with it. And then, because she deserved all of it, because I would not do to her what had been done to me, and leave her half-informed, I slid the printout across the table. The badge records. Grant Kessler's badge entering the corridor minutes after her mother's, on the very nights the charts were changed. Leaving minutes after, 2 in the morning. Again and again. Emily read it. She was a smart girl, my daughter, sharp like her mother, in all the ways that had nothing to do with cruelty. And I watched her understand what those badge swipes meant before I had to say a single word about affairs or ambition or restructuring proposals. I watched her do the math a child never wants to do about her own mother at 2 in the morning in an empty hallway with a man who was not her father. Her hand came up to her mouth, and then the tears came all at once. The way a dam does not leak but breaks. "Why?" she said. And it was not really a question to me, it was a question to the universe, the same one I had sat with in Ray's basement. Why would she? We were. I thought we were. She could not finish any of the sentences. Every one of them started somewhere safe and ran off a cliff. I did the only thing I could do. I got up from my side of the booth and I came around, and I sat beside her, and I put my arm around my daughter for the first time in what felt like years, and she turned into my shoulder, and she wept, a grown woman and a grieving child at once. And I want to tell you that in that moment I felt vindicated, that some part of me was glad she finally saw. But that is not the truth. The truth is that I would have given almost anything to spare her this. I had won her back, and the winning had cost her the mother she thought she had. And I held her in that vinyl booth and understood that some victories are indistinguishable from grief. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she said into my shoulder over and over. I said those things. I believed her. I looked right at you and You didn't know," I said. "She made sure you didn't know. That's not your fault. That was never your fault." I held her tighter. "You held on to what you saw on that chart, even when she told you not to, even when it would have been easier to let it go. You held on to your own eyes, Emily. That's the whole reason we're sitting here. That's the best of me and you, and the best of your mother too, whatever else she turned out to be." We sat in that booth a long time, my daughter and I, while her coffee went cold, and outside the ordinary traffic of an ordinary afternoon went by, none of it, knowing that a family was ending and in some smaller, broken way, beginning again at a corner table. And when she finally sat up and wiped her face, she asked the question I had been both dreading and waiting for. "What are you going to do now?" I had not yet answered Emily's question, not fully, when the answer came looking for me. 2 days after the diner, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and a pleasant, clipped voice informed me that Mr. Kessler would like to meet with me privately off hospital grounds at my earliest convenience. Not the board, not the lawyers. Grant himself alone wanting to talk. I understood at once what it meant. Somewhere, somehow, they had caught the scent of my digging. Perhaps a badge query had flagged in a system I did not know Ray couldn't fully hide. Perhaps Emily, in her grief, had let something slip to her mother. It did not matter. Grant Kessler did not request private meetings with disgraced surgeons unless he was worried. And a worried man is a man who has decided to offer you something. We met at a steakhouse near the interstate, the kind of place with heavy leather booths and waiters who know better than to hover. Grant was already there when I arrived, a glass of bourbon in front of him, his suit immaculate, his smile switched on the moment he saw me. He rose and shook my hand, as though we were old friends, as though he had not spent a year helping to dismantle my life. "Elliot, thank you for coming. Sit, please. Order anything you like." I sat. I did not order anything. I folded my hands on the table and I waited because I had learned that the man who speaks first in a negotiation is usually the man who is afraid, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, it was not going to be me. He talked for a while about nothing, the weather, a mutual acquaintance, the sad state of the healthcare industry. And then with the smooth transition of a man who has closed 1,000 deals, he arrived at the point. "I'm going to be candid with you because I respect you," he said, which is a thing people only say right before they lie to you. "This review has been painful for everyone, for you obviously, but also for the institution, for your family. It's ugly, and it's going to get uglier, and I've been thinking about whether there's a way to make all of this stop before it destroys more than it already has." He turned his bourbon glass slowly on the tablecloth. "I've spoken to some people on the board, informally, and I believe I could arrange for the complaint to be quietly withdrawn. No finding of wrongdoing. Your record stays clean, and in exchange you would take a full early retirement effective immediately. A generous package, very generous. Your pension plus a settlement that would let you and Emily walk away from all of this comfortably and never have to look back." There it was, the bribe wrapped in the silk of concern. I understood every layer of it. They knew I had found something. They did not yet know exactly what, or they would not be offering. They would simply be burying me. This was a man hedging his bets, buying my silence before he learned it could not be bought. The clean record, the money, the peace, all of it was real, and all of it was a leash. And Vivian, like I asked, something flickered in his eyes, quickly hidden. "Your wife's situation is separate. Between the two of you, I wouldn't presume." "Of course not." I looked at him for a long moment. This smooth, powerful man who had helped a woman erase her own husband so that a department could be reorganized and 2 careers could climb. And I felt sitting there a strange and total calm. Because 2 weeks ago, this offer would have terrified me with its temptation. A clean record, my daughter's comfort, an end to the ugliness. My father would have taken it and told himself he was being wise. Even a week ago, I might have wavered, and I will not pretend the temptation was nothing even now. It sat there on the table between us, real and heavy and reasonable. I was 54 years old. I had lost my work, my wife, most of what I had built. I could take the money and walk into a quiet life with my daughter, and never again have to stand in front of people I respected and make them look at what my marriage had really been. There is a version of dignity that looks exactly like surrender, and Grant was offering it on a silver platter. That is the thing no one tells you about doing the right thing. The wrong thing does not tempt you because it is evil. It tempts you because it is easier and you are so very tired, and it comes dressed as peace. But I had sat in a basement and watched my wife's face turn toward a hidden camera. I had held my weeping daughter in a vinyl booth. I had opened my father's bag and read a dead man's handwriting. I was not the same man Grant Kessler thought he was buying. Let me make sure I understand," I said quietly. "You would clear my name, the name your people spent a year destroying in exchange for my silence. I disappear. I take the money, and everyone who whispered that I was a fraud goes right on believing it, because a withdrawn complaint isn't the same as innocence. My patients think I retired under a cloud. My colleagues think I was guilty and got a quiet deal. And the 2 people who did this keep their careers and their futures, and my daughter grows up knowing the truth, but watching the world honor the liars." I shook my head slowly. "You're not offering to give me my name back, Grant. You're offering to pay me to help you keep it." The smile did not leave his face, but it changed. It hardened at the edges, and something colder came up behind his eyes, and for the first time, I saw the man underneath the suit. "I'd think very carefully, Elliot," he said, and his voice had lost its warmth entirely. "This is the good offer. This is me being kind. You're a smart man. You know how these reviews go when someone decides to fight. The accusations get worse. The scrutiny widens. Things come out that a man might prefer. Stayed private about him, about his family, about his daughter's judgment in her own work. He let that sit. I'd hate to see this get personal. So take the weekend. Think about your options. Think about what you actually have versus what you think you have. And then be smart. He set his glass down, buttoned his jacket, and left me alone in the booth with the check. I did not touch it. I sat there for a while, turning his words over, and I found to my own surprise that I was not afraid. He had threatened me and threatened Emily, and it had told me the one thing I most needed to know. Grant Kessler was scared. You do not threaten a man you have already beaten. You only threaten a man you are afraid might beat you. Which meant that whatever I had, it was enough to frighten the most powerful man in that hospital. But I made myself sit with the threat too, because it was not empty. He had said scrutiny would widen, that things would come out about my daughter's judgment in her own work. He was telling me in the language of powerful men that if I fought, they would come for Emily. They would find some chart she had touched and turn the same machine on her that they had turned on me. I understood then that the only real protection for Emily was not silence. It was overwhelming proof. If I brought them a case so complete that it collapsed the whole conspiracy at once, there would be no machine left standing to aim at my child. Only the whole truth delivered all at once could keep her safe. I took out my phone and I called Ray, and I said 4 words. It's time, set it up. Ray and I spent the weekend building the case the way I had once built a surgical plan, methodically leaving nothing to chance. The footage of all 3 nights. The badge records placing Grant in the corridor. The board minutes laying out the motive. My paper calendar proving I was in surgery when the false entries were stamped. Ray even managed through a contact in the records vendor's company to obtain a certified log showing that the audit histories of all 3 charts had been wiped 3 days after my suspension using an administrator credential. We laid it all out on the workbench in his basement, page by page, image by image, and I made myself examine it the way a reviewer would, coldly looking for the hole. Because I knew Grant would look for the hole. A man like that does not surrender to a pile of documents. He picks at the weakest thread and pulls until the whole thing unravels, and if there was a weak thread anywhere in my case, I needed to find it before he did. And there was one. All of my evidence, powerful as it was paper and pixels, timestamps and printouts and grainy footage. Every piece of it could be questioned, called a forgery, called a coincidence, called the desperate fabrication of a disgraced man with a maintenance worker's help. What I did not have, what I needed, was a human being. A living person who had seen the machine work and survived to describe it. And I already knew who that person was. I had known since the first night at my kitchen table when a voicemail transcript I had ignored for 14 months finally finished its slow journey to my attention. Dana Whitfield. The nurse who had seen it 14 months ago, who had left me a message I never returned, who had resigned and vanished. If she had noticed something back then, she was a living witness, a human being who could stand up and say, I tried to tell someone, and no one listened. Footage could be argued about. A person looking a board in the eye could not be so easily dismissed. But more than that, I needed to find her for a reason that had nothing to do with the case. I owed her an apology 14 months overdue. I thought about her a great deal that weekend, and each time I did a particular shame settled over me. I had built my entire self-image on being a man who listened, who paid attention, whose great virtue was that he saw his patients as people, and not as cases. And yet, when a frightened young woman had come to me with the truth in her hands, I had filed her under later and never thought of her again. I told myself I was busy. I was busy. But my father had been busy too, and it had not saved him. And I was beginning to understand that busy is just the respectable word we use for the things we choose not to see. Dana had paid for my blindness with her career. Whatever happened at that board, I was going to make it right, or I was going to spend the rest of my life knowing I had let it stand. It took Ray half a day to track her down. She had moved to Knoxville, taken a job at a smaller hospital, started over. I did not want to ambush her, so I sent a short, careful message explaining who I was, that I understood if she never wanted to hear from me, but that the thing she had tried to warn me about had come true, and I was finally listening. I did not expect a reply. She wrote back within the hour. Just an address and a time and 3 words. I've been waiting. I drove to Knoxville the next morning. She met me in a coffee shop near the university, and she was older than the voicemail in my memory, more tired around the eyes, a young woman who had learned something hard too early. When I sat down across from her, she looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "You never called me back." "I know," I said. "I know I didn't. And I have spent every day since I found your message trying to understand how I could have been so blind. I was busy. That is not an excuse, it is just the truth. And it is the worst truth of my life because you saw it, Dinah. You saw it when it could still have been stopped, and you came to me, and I was too busy saving strangers to listen to you. I am more sorry than I know how to say." She was quiet for a while, turning her cup in her hands. "I almost didn't come to you at all," she said finally. I noticed a note on a chart that didn't match what I'd charted myself. A discharged patient, a complication that never happened. I thought it was a system error at first, but then I looked closer and I saw it had your signature, and the timestamp was a night I knew you weren't even in the building. And I got scared. Because there's only a few people who could do that, and one of them was the head nurse, and the head nurse was your wife. She looked up at me. I didn't know who I could trust, so I came to you because everyone said you were the honest one. And when you didn't call back, I thought maybe he already knows. Maybe he's part of it. Maybe I'm the only one who thinks this is wrong, and if I keep pushing, I'm the one who disappears. What happened? I asked, though I was beginning to dread the answer. Your wife happened," she said simply. "And Mr. Kessler. About 2 weeks after I left that voicemail, I got called into a meeting. Just the 3 of us. They were very kind about it. They said there had been some concerns about my documentation. Some errors in my charting, nothing serious. But that combined with my attitude, my difficulty fitting in with the team, they thought I might be happier somewhere else. They offered me a good reference and a small severance if I resigned quietly. And they made it very clear, without ever quite saying it, that if I didn't, the concerns about my charting might become something more formal." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "They did to me in miniature exactly what they were doing to you. They built a little paper case, and they used it to make me go away. I was 28. I didn't have 30 years of reputation to fight with. So I took the reference and I left, and I've spent 14 months feeling like a coward." "No, you were not a coward," I said, and I meant it with everything in me. "You were a young woman standing alone against 2 powerful people who had already decided to destroy anyone in their way. You did the one brave thing available to you. You told the truth to the person you thought could act on it. The failure after that was mine, not yours." I leaned forward. "But it is not too late. Not for either of us. I have proof now, Dana. All of it. And I am going to walk into that board and put it on the table. I am not asking you to fight my battle. But if you were willing to tell them what you just told me, that you saw it, that you reported it, that they forced you out to bury it, then this stops being one bitter man's accusation. It becomes a pattern. It becomes a conspiracy with a witness. She looked at me for a long time, and then slowly she nodded. 14 months, she said quietly. I've been rehearsing what I'd say if anyone ever asked. Nobody ever asked. She wrapped both hands around her cup. When and where? I'll be there. The board reconvened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after they had taken my badge, in the same fourth-floor room, with the same wall of windows looking out over the parking structure. But I walked in this time a different man than the one who had walked in the first time, laughing nervously, certain it was all a clerical error. This time I carried a leather folder, my father's leather folder, the one he had used for house calls, because some things deserve to be carried in something that has already survived one good man's ruin. I want to tell you what that walk down the fourth-floor hallway felt like, because it is the truest thing I can offer you about what this ordeal had done to me. 3 weeks earlier, I had walked this same corridor believing that a good man simply endures, that the truth rises on its own if you are patient enough to let it. I did not believe that anymore. I had spent 3 weeks learning that the truth does not rise. It has to be carried by hand, by someone willing to do the carrying even when it costs him everything he has left. I was 54 years old, and I had only just learned the lesson my father never taught me. I did not walk into that room hoping to be believed. I walked in prepared to make them believe me. The same 7 people sat at the table. The chief of medicine, the administrators, hospital counsel, the woman from compliance, and Grant Kessler at the head this time, having apparently decided his weekend threat had failed to move me, and now needed to manage the outcome directly. Vivian was there too, seated near the window, exactly where she had stood before, and when I walked in, her eyes went to me immediately, searching my face, and I understood that she still did not know how much I knew. She was expecting the same silent, absorbing man. I let her keep expecting it for one more minute. Lady Dr. Hastings, the chief of medicine, said, "You requested this hearing. The floor is yours." I stood. I opened my father's folder, and I told them everything in the same flat, steady voice I had used with Ray in the basement, the voice that does not shake no matter what is happening on the table. I walked them through the 3 altered charts and the timestamps that placed me in surgery while a lie was typed under my name. I showed them the paper calendar. I played the footage all 3 nights on the screen at the end of the table, and I watched Vivian's face as her own image appeared, sitting at that workstation, tucking her hair behind her ear. She did not gasp. She did not cry out. She simply went very white and very still, and beside her Grant's jaw tightened by a fraction most people in that room would never have noticed. I noticed. I had spent a great deal of time lately learning to notice. I showed them the badge logs, Grant's entries into that corridor, minutes behind hers, 3 times over 14 months. I showed them the board minutes outlining the restructuring plan that required my removal and rewarded Vivian's promotion. And then I told them about Dana Whitfield, and I watched the door, and on cue it opened, and she walked in a clean blazer, her chin up, and took the seat I had arranged for her. "This is Dana Whitfield," I said, "a former nurse in this department. 14 months ago, she discovered the first altered chart, the one belonging to Harold Pruitt, and she tried to report it to me. I failed to call her back in time. 2 weeks later, she was pressured out of this hospital, using a manufactured documentation complaint, the same method later used against me. She is here to tell you in her own words what she saw. Dana spoke for perhaps 5 minutes, calm and precise, and by the time she finished, there was a different quality to the silence in that room. The silence of people who understood they were no longer looking at an accusation. They were looking at a pattern. It was Grant who moved first, exactly as I had known he would, because a cornered man always attacks the newest thing in the room. "This footage," he said, standing his voice pitched for the whole table, "comes from an unauthorized, unmaintained legacy system that this hospital decommissioned years ago. There is no chain of custody, no certification. For all this board knows, it has been altered, spliced, manipulated by a maintenance employee with a personal loyalty to Dr. Hastings. I would be very careful before this board treats a piece of unverified analog footage sourced outside any approved channel as reliable evidence of anything." He looked around the table, gathering the doubt he was planting. This is precisely the kind of thing that never plays well when it hasn't gone through the proper process. For one long moment I felt the ground tilt beneath me. He was good. He had found the one thread I had worried about from the start, and he was pulling it in front of the very people who would decide my future. I saw the chief of medicine's expression shift, saw the woman from compliance lean toward her legal pad, and I understood that if this argument landed, everything else I had shown them, however damning, could be waved away as the elaborate fabrication of a desperate man. But I was not alone in that room anymore, and I had learned finally not to fight my battles single-handed. "If the board will permit," I said, "I'd like to introduce the systems administrator who can speak directly to the chain of custody." I gestured toward the door, and Ray Delgado walked in his work uniform, unhurried, carrying a single folder of his own. 31 years in this building," Ray said without waiting to be invited. "That old archive system, writes to write once, storage. Once it's recorded, it can't be altered. Not by me, not by anyone, not without physically destroying the drive itself. Every file carries a cryptographic hash, generated automatically at the moment of recording. I pulled the hash logs this morning and had them independently verified by the manufacturer, who still supports legacy units. The hash on this footage matches the original recording, unaltered down to the byte." He set his folder on the table. "In 31 years, nobody's ever managed to fake one of these. It's the whole reason I never let the hospital decommission the units. Old technology, gentlemen. Sometimes it's the only kind you can trust." The room was silent. Grant opened his mouth, and for the first time since I had known him, no smooth words came out of it. I watched the silence do its work around that table. The chief of medicine set down his pen. The woman from compliance stopped writing entirely and simply looked at Grant, and there was something new in her expression. Something that had not been there for me 3 weeks earlier. Suspicion aimed finally at the right person. Hospital counsel leaned toward the administrator beside her and murmured something I could not hear, and I did not need to hear it to know what it was. This was no longer a review of my conduct. It had become, in the space of a single testimony, an investigation into 2 other people's. I looked at Vivian then, for the first time since I had begun to speak. She had not moved through any of it, not through the footage, not through Dana, not through Ray's account of the hash logs that made her sabotage undeniable. She sat very straight, very pale, her hands folded in her lap, in a posture I recognized, because it was the same posture she had held the day she told this same board that I had been under a great deal of stress. She was still performing composure even now, even with the walls coming down around her. And I understood that this, more than anything else, was who she truly was. A woman who would manage her face through her own unmasking, because managing the face was the only thing she had ever fully trusted. It did not end with a dramatic collapse. Real ruin rarely does. It ended with paperwork, The board did not exonerate me that morning, not on the spot. Institutions do not move that fast. But something shifted in that room and never shifted back. Within the hour, the complaint against me was suspended, pending a full external investigation. Within a week, that investigation had subpoenaed the hospital's records, the badge logs, and the right-once drives Ray had guarded for 31 years. Within a month, the findings were undeniable. My name was formally cleared. My suspension expunged, my record restored to exactly what it had been for 30 years, unblemished. Grant Kessler resigned before they could remove him, citing personal reasons, the phrase powerful men use when they are jumping ahead of the fall. There were whispers of a quiet settlement, an exit negotiated to spare the hospital a public trial. Men like Grant rarely face the full weight of what they do. But he left that building without his kingdom, his reputation among the people who mattered to him quietly and permanently poisoned. And I found that I did not need him to suffer more than that. I had never wanted his suffering. I had only wanted my name. Vivian was terminated, and the medical board opened its own proceedings against her nursing license. We divorced. It was not ugly in the end because there was nothing left to fight over. The truth had already taken everything that could be taken. She signed the papers without looking at me, still composed, still managing her face, and I realized, as she walked out, that I felt no triumph watching her go. I felt only the vast, quiet grief of a man closing a door on 26 years and finding the rooms behind it already empty and long emptied. People asked me afterward why I was not happier. I had won, they said. I had been proven right, publicly, completely. The liars were exposed, the truth was told, justice was done. Why did I not feel like a man who had won? I never knew how to answer them, so I will try to answer you instead. Because if you have come this far with me, you have earned the truth. I did not feel like a man who had won, because winning had never been the shape of it. There is a story we like to tell about the wronged man who fights back and is restored, and the villains who get what they deserve and the credits that roll on a world set right. But that is not what a betrayal like this leaves behind. My name was clean, yes. But my wife was gone, and not gone, as in dead gone, as in never having been who I thought she was, which is a stranger kind of loss, one you cannot even properly grieve. My daughter and I had found our way back to each other, but there was a wound there now that would never fully close, a thing we would carry between us for the rest of our lives. The knowledge of what her mother had been, and how close I had come to letting her believe a lie about me forever. Emily still flinched sometimes when the subject came near. So did I. Some things you survive without ever quite healing. And there was one more thing, the truest thing, the thing that surprised me most of all. Standing in that restored operating room with my privileges reinstated and my name on the door again, I discovered that I no longer wanted it. Emily came with me the day I cleared out my office. She helped me pack 30 years into cardboard boxes, and neither of us said much. And at one point, she picked up a photograph from my desk. The three of us at her white coat ceremony, all of us smiling, and she stood looking at it for a long time. Then she set it face down in a box without a word, and I understood that she could not yet decide what to do with the pictures that had her mother in them, and that she might never fully decide, and that this was one of the things we would carry. She is a fine doctor, my daughter. She calls me every Sunday again, the way she used to. But sometimes in the middle of an ordinary conversation, a silence will open up between us, and I know she is thinking about the residence lounge, about the things she said to me, about how close we both came to losing each other to a lie. Neither of us ever brings it up. We just wait for the silence to pass. That is what healing actually looks like, I have learned. Not a wound that closes without a scar, but two people who love each other learning to live around the scar together. I had spent 3 decades believing that this work was who I was, that the surgeon was the man, and the man was the surgeon, and there was nothing underneath. But the ordeal had cut all of that away, and in the empty place it left, I had found someone I did not entirely recognize. A man who had gone down into a basement and dug the truth out with his own hands. A man who had learned at 54 to stop waiting and start fighting. That man did not belong to Ashcombe Regional, to the fourth-floor boardroom, to the machine that had nearly destroyed him and would, given the chance, do it again to someone else. That man belonged somewhere smaller and truer. So I did the thing that shocked everyone who knew me. I did not go back. I resigned on my own terms this time, with my name clean and my choice entirely my own, and that distinction was everything. I was not driven out. I walked out upright, having proven what I needed to prove, and then having decided that proving it was enough. I took my father's medical bag down from the high shelf where it had lived for so long, and I did not put it back. I loaded it into my car along with a few boxes of books and instruments, and I drove south out of the city, past the last of the suburbs, into the green rolling country around Leiper's Fork, where the traffic thins and the hills open up, and a man can hear himself think again. There was a small building there, an old feed store with good bones and a for sale sign gone gray in the weather, and I had already made an offer on it. It was going to be a clinic. A small one. The kind of place my father would have understood, where you know your patients by name, and there is no board 4 floors up and no system that remembers things wrong. I want to leave you, before I tell you the rest, with a single image, because it is the one I carry. It is the image of that leather bag on the passenger seat beside me, cracked and old and full of a dead man's tools, riding south toward a life I never planned and would not trade. I had lost my wife. I had lost the marriage I thought I had, and the past I thought I remembered, and a piece of my daughter I would never get back. But I had found my father again, out there on that road, 40 years too late and right on time. And I had finally learned the thing he never could. The clinic in Leiper's Fork has been open 2 years now. On the shelf behind my desk sits my father's leather bag, cracked and gentle with age, and every morning I set it there before the first patient arrives, and every evening it is the last thing I see when I turn off the light. I have never once used the instruments inside it. That was never the point. The point is that it is there, and that I am the man who finally learned to open it. I spent most of my life believing that if you simply did right and stayed quiet, the truth would rise on its own and carry you home. I was wrong, and it nearly cost me everything. The truth has no hands. It cannot defend the innocent or expose the guilty or clear a good man's name. It waits buried patient until someone who loves it enough goes down into the dark and lifts it into the light. Silence is not the same as goodness. Sometimes the most loving thing a person can do is refuse to stay quiet. I think often now about the man I was and the man I became, and how much was lost in the space between them. I do not tell you this story so that you will hate anyone. I tell it because I have come to believe that God does not spare us from being tested. God gives us the strength to meet the test. And I have learned that grace is not the absence of wounds, but the courage to keep loving through them. Whatever God is teaching you in your own hardest season, I pray you find the strength to carry the truth even when it is heavy, even when it costs you. And so I leave you with the question that has never once let me go. If the person betraying you were someone you loved with your whole heart, someone you had built your entire life around, would you have the courage to speak the truth, knowing it might end everything? Or would you choose the quiet and call it peace? There is no easy answer, and I do not pretend to have one. But I would be honored to hear yours. Share it in the comments below, and if this story stayed with you, follow along, because there are more of them to tell, and I would be grateful to have you here for the next one.